Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Lazar. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm excited to be talking with you this morning about born accessible design. I'm a professor in the College of Information. I'm also executive director of the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. Now, first, let's all be in agreement about what we mean when we talk about digital accessibility. We mean that a person with a disability can secure the same information and engage in the same transactions as a person without a disability with substantially equivalent ease of use. What that means is that if it takes someone without a disability, let's say 20 seconds to accomplish a task, it shouldn't take 3 workarounds and 10 minutes for someone with a disability to complete that same task. It needs to be substantially equivalent ease of use. Now, I mentioned the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility, or MIDA. It's a new campus-wide initiative funded by the University of Maryland Grand Challenges program, where we have over 50 faculty and staff and many graduate students, all of whom are passionate and dedicated to making the world of technology more inclusive. We have a number of different working groups and different projects, but overall we have 5 goals. Goal number 1, building a community of faculty, staff, and students at the university who are passionate about digital accessibility. Number 2, creating mechanisms, including advisory boards, to help engage the university with external stakeholders. So we have, for instance, a disability rights advisory board with 16 different disability rights groups and government agencies focused on disability. We have a technology industry advisory board with accessibility representatives from major companies like Google, Microsoft, and Adobe, and also working with policymakers at both the state and federal level. Goal number 3 is that we are working with these external partners on 2 major projects focused on the born accessible approach. How do we move the world more towards born accessible technologies? We're working on getting sustaining funding through research proposals and corporate funding as well. And also, we want to hold events on campus to increase the awareness of digital accessibility through public programs. So check us out, mida.umd.edu. And again, thanks to the Grand Challenges program for funding the creation of MIDA. Now, inaccessible digital technologies are a barrier to inclusion in education, health, employment, commerce, and civic engagement until the technology is remediated. You might have heard this before, right? So for instance, if there's a student in a class and they don't get the videos, right, with captioning until the end of the class, all the other students had the videos. The student maybe who needs captioning because they have a learning disability or because they're deaf or hard of hearing, if they only get the captioning at the end of the semester, right, the student had to wait. They had to wait for it to be remediated. And that's a barrier to inclusion, right? And there are many examples where technologies are released to the general public, right? But people with disabilities have to wait until those technologies are remediated for accessibility. But I have a question for all of you. Why do we need to wait until the technology is remediated? That doesn't make sense to me. Why is it we're building inaccessibly and then saying, well, at some point we'll remediate it? Maybe there's a legal complaint, right? Maybe there's some other action. Someone says they want it, but we'll wait. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how we build buildings, and that's not an effective approach. And that's what Elizabeth Churchill said in her 2017 article, Putting Accessibility First, in Interactions magazine. She said, it is not an effective approach to build technology inaccessibly and then wait and eventually remediate it. That makes no sense. It's not cost effective. And as I've been writing about for years, as has my colleague Paul Yeager, right, if you make people with disabilities wait, that delay is a form of societal discrimination. So we need to rethink this approach. You may have heard people sometimes say, well, accessibility is expensive. Actually, building accessibly is not expensive. Remediating after the fact is where the cost comes in. So, for instance, you may have heard accessibility can cause the amount of software code to double in size. That's what one study said. But the reality is because the reason that it had all this extra code is because you had to remediate after the fact. It wasn't built accessibly first. Again, why would you build something in the wrong way and then eventually wait and fix it? Yet this is how most technologies are built. Even if they are made accessible before they're released, typically they build something, then at the end they'll test for accessibility, they'll find their problems, they'll go back and fix it. Why are we not building accessibly from the start, right? Because as Churchill said, when accessibility requirements are deferred, you have a backlog of accessibility debt. And so you have downstream costs. You may find that there are things that the way you design them actually is not an effective approach, and you can't remediate it. So for instance, again, Elizabeth Churchill's example, you may design a complex workflow with intricate elements to complete a task. If you haven't considered accessibility up front, you may discover that some of the elements are impossible to build for accessibility, and then you have to rebuild the entire workflow from scratch. This is not effective. This is not inclusive. This is discriminatory. It's also not cost effective, right? Because this will slow you down, what Elizabeth is describing, far more than taking these requirements into account at the beginning ever could. So remediating after the fact for accessibility is not going to be either the most innovative or elegant design solution. If you look at architecture, think about it. If you build a building from scratch and you look at the image on the right where you have a building where it was an elegant entryway and it was a ramp. On the left, you have an image of some stairs that were remediated with what looks to be an unsafe ramp. That's not good. So building from the start to be accessible, first of all, it makes sure that people with disabilities have access at the same time. Second of all, it makes sure that you have a much lower cost for accessibility. You know, if you build it accessibly from the start, the costs approach zero. It's the remediation that's expensive. And third, if you create technologies and content that are accessible from the start, they are going to be the most elegant and most innovative designs. Now, we need to acknowledge for a minute, we at the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility want the entire world to move towards the born accessible approach. For any technologies, any content, any digital website, operating system, software, mobile app, we want everything going forward to be built accessibly from the start. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that we have tons of technologies that already exist, and so we still need to research and develop solutions for remediation. You know, you have something like 1 trillion PDF documents out there that are inaccessible. We still need solutions to remediate existing documents, right? Even if we make everything born accessible first, we need to focus on making everything accessible. So we need both born accessible and remediation approaches. So what does it mean to be born accessible? So when we first wanted to investigate more about born accessible design, right, it turns out there's really nothing in the research literature about this. So I reached out to all of the disability rights groups that are involved in the MIDA Disability Rights Advisory Board, so 16 groups, and said, what does born accessible mean to you, right? As groups, you're often advocating for a born accessible approach. But we don't really have a full model yet in the human-computer interaction literature. It's almost more like a concept or a theory. So what does it mean to you? And their answers clustered around 4 core concepts. One, that you have to set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project. 2, that you have to include people with disabilities in the start of the design process and going forward. 3, you have to code to accessibility standards. And 4, involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. And we're going to talk about what each one of those things means. So the first of the core concepts of the born accessible approach. First, set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project. So what does that mean? If you're developing technology in-house, have accessibility be a required goal. Use checklists, personas, and scenarios involving people with disabilities. Have a policy in place that you will release no versions, no technologies, no content that is not accessible. Now, if you are somehow contracting for outside organizations to build or develop your technology or content, use procurement clauses that require accessibility, and especially indemnification clauses that specify what the accessibility requirements are, and also note that the vendor is on the hook if you get sued for accessibility. So clearly define don't just say, well, legally we need to be accessible. Be clear about which specific statutes apply to your organization. Is it Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act? Is it Title III because you're a public accommodation, but you're not state and local government, which would make you Title II? Are you federal government? So Section 508 would apply, right? Is it the Air Carrier Access Act because you're an airline? Be very clear about the legal methods so that people understand what they are. Because, for instance, there are different requirements. You know, the new rule in Title II of the ADA will require the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's not yet required in Title III. Right? The Air Carrier Access Act requires not only the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but also involving people with disabilities in testing. So you need to know which statute applies to your organization. Now, if you look at organizations like Apple, Sarah Herlinger, right, director of accessibility at Apple, said accessibility is something that's brought in at the very early stages of everything that we do. The accessibility teams, they're working with every design team on every new product to say, okay, we're going to come out with whatever this new technology might be. How do we make sure that it's accessible? And so that's their approach, right? Slack is saying the same thing. Some of their lead designers are talking about how we're baking accessibility into our process and the way that we fundamentally work. So the second concept, include people with disabilities from the start of the design process. Right? Again, Sarah Herlinger, director of accessibility at Apple, said, we've always incorporated members of the community into the process as we've done this. We believe in the mantra of the disability rights community, of nothing about us without us, because you can't design a product that's really going to work for someone if you're on the outside looking in and you think you know how something's going to work, but actually it's not how it works. Now, philosophically, the born accessible model, or the approach, is within the traditions of participatory design, user-centered design, and value-sensitive design. But often in those approaches, they say, well, who are your users, right? Define who your user group is. Part of the born accessible approach is people with disabilities are always your users. If at any point you say, well, people with disabilities are not our users, you're probably excluding them and not realizing that you potentially do have users with disabilities. But philosophically, it is about involving users. So what are some of the methods here, right? Well, it's really useful to have people with various disabilities as members of the development team, as actual developers, right? But also keep in mind that developers who have disabilities probably are going to be a little bit more advanced than your typical user with a disability. So using participatory design approaches, right? That's useful. The approach we use in MIDA, right? User advisory boards or disability rights advisory boards, where either you have people internally in your organization who have disabilities who serve in an advisory board capacity, or we actually for MIDA have a disability rights advisory board where we have organizations representing. And organizations can offer many benefits. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the idea is you have an ongoing conversation with either individuals or groups, right, involving people with disabilities. Now, if you search on the web, you might search on Born Accessible and say, well, there's actually a lot about Born Accessible. It's only within the category of book publishers. So Benetech probably will be the one page you'll find. So Benetech does a lot of accessible ebooks. And so, right, Bookshare, if you've heard of Bookshare, Benetech project. So most publishers, though, are talking about Born Accessible. What they mean is not interactive technologies. They mean that when they publish a print book, they also publish an electronic version of it that's accessible at the same time. So you get the paper book and the electronic accessible book at the same time. Now, this is important because, right, we want publishers to do that. But their approaches for Born Accessible, it's different because what we're talking about is interactive technologies, websites, right, software, mobile apps. It's a little bit different because with the books, it's kind of a one and done, right? You make sure that when the book's coming out, it's also accessible. The book doesn't change. You don't interact with the book that much, right? We're talking about interactive technologies. So that's why it's a little bit different. The third core concept, code to accessibility standards. Now, the best known accessibility standards are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're cited by governments around the world, often in their statutes related to disability rights, most often related to web content. But realize those are not the only guidelines. Those are just the ones for web content. Now, because there are other content markup, obviously like EPUB 3 for ebooks, right? PDF UA, accessible PDF documents. So for other forms of content, there may be other approaches, other technical standards that are useful. However, it's important to note WCAG is still the one that's best known around the world, and WCAG is written in a way that you can apply the concepts of WCAG, right, to non-web technologies, to mobile apps, to operating systems, to software. And in fact, a way to do that is to read the WCAG 2 ICT document, which is all about applying WCAG concepts to non-web technologies. So WCAG, there's so much out there, people know it, let's use it as much as possible. Now, you might say, but if we use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, isn't that enough? Not really, because what happens is that often it's a floor, not a ceiling. So for instance, yeah, those are the basics. If you are compliant with or conformant with WCAG. There's a classic study, a CHI paper from Chris Power et al., right? They found that only about half the problems encountered by blind users were covered by success criteria in WCAG 2.0. So just following technical standards isn't sufficient to make it a good, usable experience. It's a floor, it's not a ceiling. Many governments, unfortunately, take this approach. They say accessibility means just following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But there's been a fair amount of research done about how that doesn't mean that technologies will be usable by people with disabilities. It doesn't mean they can be effective. It's just a floor. So I like to think of it as broad accessibility versus very narrow. A very narrow accessibility is we just focus on conformance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Much broader is that we involve people with disabilities in the process. We do testing involving people with disabilities, right, where they test the interfaces, all of these different things. We have it as a core design goal. So really, the Born Accessible approach is a much broader version of accessibility than just compliance with technical standards. So what are some methods for this concept of Born Accessible? Certainly, if coding, use standards. If creating content, right, use tools that generate accessible content and make sure that every single accessibility feature in those tools is enabled. When you evaluate later on, when you evaluate for accessibility, make sure that you use manual inspections for compliance with WCAG or other, rather than automated tools, because automated tools often give misleading findings. And use accessible page templates. If you're doing a website and you're doing web pages, we're using templates. Make sure all the templates are accessible, because there's research on that I published about a decade ago that if you start with an accessible web page template, you're much more likely to have an accessible website. So the fourth concept is involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. Now you might say this is common, right? Of course you do usability testing. It's actually a little bit different when you're talking about Born Accessible. So first of all, you need to have users different than those involved in the development process, right? You want to make sure that you have a much broader set of people, a much larger number of disabilities and people with different levels of that disability. So, don't just have, let's say, one blind user, right, who is involved as a developer. Have multiple people, some people maybe who are blind and have no residual vision, who use Braille, some who use screen readers, maybe have some who are low vision and maybe use a magnifier. So you have to be really clear about how many users we want to involve with all these different backgrounds. So very clear inclusion criteria and very diverse. You don't want to have proxy users. A proxy user is where you, let's say, ask a caregiver or a therapist or something like that. No, don't do that. Have people with disabilities themselves. Often you can't ask people with disability, like, for instance, what's your visual acuity? Because that's the medical model. That's, asking people their medical data. What we do instead is we ask them, what technologies can you use? Like, for instance, you can generally tell if someone has residual vision based on whether or not they can use screen magnification or not. If you're not able to use screen magnification, you likely don't have much residual vision, right? So, other things. First of all, you want to make sure that you use people's own technology builds. Often when we do usability testing, we say we're just going to give people a standard technology. But that's, for people with disabilities, they often have settings and a build that works for them. Give flexibility. Maybe they don't need to come into the lab. We can do it distributed. We learned that during the pandemic. Plan for transport for people if they need. Don't make last-minute changes. If there are people with cognitive impairment who want to modify the task because they don't feel comfortable with, let's say, using, a fake test account or something, that's okay. If you need to change the format of communication, right? If you need to make it print, if you need to have Braille, that's okay. There are lots of approaches that are well documented. And an approach like what the National Health Service uses in the UK. Every 2 weeks, they do a sprint of user evaluations, and 1 out of every 6 of those user evaluations must have a diverse need. That's a great way to approach it. So in summary, the Born Accessible approach, right? We're moving towards a model. The 4 core concepts: set clear accessibility goals from the start, include people with disabilities, right, from the start of the design process, code to accessibility standards, and involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. Now, we have 2 current projects focused on learning more about the Born Accessible model with Adobe and the US Access Board. With Adobe, we're helping them change their Adobe Express product so that it will generate accessible content by supporting content creators. Abhinav will be presenting later today about that project, so I won't say any more. But what are we learning so far from these projects? There are lots of interesting political, power dynamic questions, about the born accessible approach. For instance, which disabilities do you invite? Which representatives? Do you do individual users or disability rights groups? What are the power dynamics? For instance, if you're saying you may not release anything that is not accessible, that takes power away from developers. How do they handle that, right? What are the legal standards, and how does, right, existing statute, regulation, how does all of that impact the design? As I mentioned earlier, like the Air Carrier Access Act is the only one of the statutes that actually at this point has a testing requirement where either individuals with disabilities or disability rights groups must be involved. And also there's sort of the dynamic of, we as MIDA, as university researchers and developers, are serving as an intermediary between tech companies and policymakers, right? And so there's some interesting dynamics there. So hopefully next year we'll be able to report a lot back to you about how you do the born accessible approach, right? And kind of what the best practices are. I want to thank you again for your time. Again, my name is Jonathan Lazar. Please reach out to me at jlazar@umd.edu or check out mida.umd.edu. Thank you so much.